Hello, Walter. Good afternoon, Walter. How are you? Walter? Hello, Walter. Walter, can you hear me? Hello, Walter. Hi, Walter. Hello, Heidi. How are you, Heidi?
Fine, thank you.
Good, good. And Walter, can you hear us? Well, Walter, I can see that you're there, but so far I can't hear you. You might try logging in again, and then maybe you'll be able to get the audio. But actually, Heidi, let's try to start right on time here. And so would you offer our opening prayer for us?
You bet.
Thank you so much.
Our gracious Father in heaven, as we come before Thee and ask for Thy help before this history class today, we wish to thank Thee for the many blessings which we have, and especially this opportunity we have to be able to study the words of Thomas Jefferson, this great leader of our nation. We ask that we can be taught through the Spirit, and we know those things that are true and those things that we can learn and know of today to help our own country in need. We're grateful for the time and effort that Mr. Gentile has put into preparing these lessons and are so grateful for this opportunity to learn, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thanks a lot, Heidi. Okay, well, Walter, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, great. We couldn't hear you at the beginning, but so welcome to today's class. It is Wednesday, the 28th of October, and let's see here. I will start our slideshow. I'm really excited for today's class because this document by Thomas Jefferson is one of my absolute favorites from the Revolution. I think there are so many rich things hidden in it, and it's really just such a unique and important document for so many different reasons. So I really look forward to our conversation today about it. I wanted to start by just having us think about sort of the pulse of America around this time. We've left off with Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, and Dickinson actually wrote a song shortly thereafter called the Liberty Song that really reveals sort of the character and the opinion of many Americans in 1768 when he wrote the song, which is where we're going to pick up today as we march forth towards 1774 and Thomas Jefferson's summary view of the rights of British America. I love looking at the lyrics to this song. I think they tell us so much about the Americans at this time. So just think about what these things mean. Come join hand in hand, brave Americans all, and rouse your bold hearts at fair liberty's call. No tyrannous acts shall suppress your just claim or stain with dishonor America's name. And then this chorus that goes on and on here. In freedom we're born and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as freemen, our money will give. And it goes on and talks about some other verses. And in fact, there are verses that list all of the abuses of American freedom from the Grenville program to the present of 1768. And it's really just a neat song. So just keep that in mind here. This sort of call of liberty in the hearts of Americans as we're talking about what we discussed today. Well, 1768 through 1773 here, I just want to give you sort of a little overview on this outline, and then we're going to pull back, or I guess maybe dive deeper, and look at a few specific events and then spotlight a personality here. So by 1768, there were 4 regiments of British troops, right? So keep in mind, this is a standing army, okay, sent to Boston. By 1770, we have the Boston Massacre. 1770, the repeal of the Townsend Revenue Act, which Dickinson was protesting in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, except for the tax on tea, which wasn't repealed. It was kept as a reminder of Britain's power to tax, kind of like the Declaratory Act in 1766, which was a reminder that, wait a minute, we have the ability to bind you in all cases whatsoever, so watch out. 1772, we'll talk about this event. This was the burning of a ship off the coast of Rhode Island, the burning of the Gaspé. 1773, we have Governor Thomas Hutchinson versus the Massachusetts General Court in this very famous debate that goes back and forth that I'll share a little bit more about in a second. 1773, Hutchinson's letters to Thomas Whately were published, which caused a big stir because they painted Hutchinson's opinion of the American colonists and what they were doing in a very, very black hue, and really excited the British government against the Americans in many ways. 1773, we have the Tea Act to try to help the beleaguered East India Tea Company. 1773, we have the Boston Tea Party. So now, if we pull back for a second and look at the significance of some of these events, our purpose today is not to go really in depth in these events, but just so you have a little bit more idea of the significance of the Boston Massacre, as it's known, 1770. And remember that along with the Gaspé Affair and the Boston Tea Party, right, among other events, this event here symbolized the increasingly violent nature of colonial protests. And it will become a rallying point for patriot propagandists like Paul Revere. Those of you who have been to American Heritage know that in the high school hallway, there's actually a copy of Paul Revere's Bloody Massacre, which helped to shape popular memory of the event that would become known as the Boston Massacre. Remember, there were 5 people who were killed, and 11 of the 13 people tried. Those accused were actually acquitted in the trial, but yet Revere wants us to remember this massacre, this terribly bloody event. He talked about the streets running with blood and the British Custom House as this house of blood, and this shaping of memory became so important, in fact, more important than what actually had happened in terms of rallying the colonies towards revolution. Well, if we look at the significance of the Gaspé Affair, 1772, we have this British ship that was foundering off the coast of Rhode Island, and because the Americans don't want these items to come ashore because they would be taxed, they burn this royal ship. They burn it, and it goes up in flames. And it's interesting because there is a cover-up of this act of defiance, and even the governor's involved and really just sort of looks the other way, and nothing ends up happening to the men who burned the ship, which really just shows just how much the opinion had turned against the British by this time. It's also important because this Gaspé Affair resulted in the extension of Sam Adams' system of committees of correspondence, which had been going around and informing each other of what was happening, sort of the latest revolutionary news. But now, with the Gaspé Affair and the Virginia Resolves, which basically said, listen, as colonies, we need to band together, and any time our liberties are taken away, we need to talk about it. We need to let people know what's going on so we can affect change in the larger body of the people. And all of the colonies except North Carolina and Pennsylvania will join in these will join favorably behind these Virginia Resolves. And so you see that there's a sense of unity and common purpose, developing. The Tea Party, another of the events on our timeline of 1773, is so important because it led to other tea parties that maybe aren't as famous, but yet there were many others elsewhere in the colonies, and together they successfully nullified the Tea Act that was so hated. It was this catalytic event because it led directly to the Coercive Acts, and then the Coercive Acts led to this united response by the colonies that would cause a shooting war within a year and a half. And so Boston's cause is the Coercive Acts, and we'll talk more about those specific acts as we just continue to give a little context to what Jefferson is going to say. But Boston's cause with the Boston Port Act and the Massachusetts Government Act and the Administration of Justice Act and Quartering Acts, as Boston is oppressed by the government, Boston's cause becomes the cause of all of the colonies, and they rally behind Boston in the First Continental Congress, which is called to address the situation. They create this continental-wide association of boycotts and other economic sanctions against Britain to try to change things. And so really you see people starting to work together in really magnificent ways. And so because of this, because you have this violent act that leads to these coercive acts, which are just so oppressive, and you have this incredibly shocking response by the colonists, at least to Great Britain, right? Now we will end up gaining American independence by a revolution rather than by a sort of a slow evolution. which is just an important thing to keep in mind. Well, I just wanted to spotlight for a second here Thomas Hutchinson, because I think that in so many ways he embodies all that the colonists hated about British control in the 1770s. It's interesting to note here just some quotes. By 1774, he was more hated than Lord North and more hated than George III. And it's interesting because Elbridge Gerry, a Marblehead town father, and as we know, would be a vice president of the United States, he would call Thomas Hutchinson an arbitrary minister, and he'd talk about the bravery of the Whig defiance against him in the Tea Party, and say that bravery would be compared to a diadem of honor that would render the name of Bostonian respected and revered to the latest posterity. It's interesting, too, because people were writing plays about Hutchinson, about what a terrible person he was. And remember, Hutchinson represented the power, the control of Britain. And so here they compare Hutchinson to Nero in Mercy Otis Warren's 1772 melodrama called The Adulator, which is just interesting. There's this wonderful line from it that says, "O'er fields of death with hastening step I'll speed, and smile at length to see my country bleed. From my tame heart the pang of virtue fling, and mid the general flame like Nero sing." And so here we have this question that I ask to us. How did such a circumspect and fair-spoken man as James Otis, who we've read, described Hutchinson, become the Nero of Massachusetts, and why did the colonists blame him for setting their province ablaze with the incendiary Coercive Acts? And it's so important to understand these Coercive Acts because Thomas Jefferson, in his summary view, will be responding directly to these Coercive Acts. Well, it's interesting, too, because Hutchinson, like I said, as this symbol of British power, also has this very famous encounter with the Massachusetts General Court in January 6th of 1773. And he cites an argument given by many philosophers, including Rousseau, in 1762 in his Social Contract, where he basically says that sovereignty can't be divided. And so either Parliament is sovereign over the colonies or the colonies are independent. Now, it's interesting because Hutchinson felt that there was just this logic that would sort of sweep everybody away. Of course we're not independent because, we're part of the British Empire, because there was this long-standing argument of imperium in imperio, which literally means that you can't have an empire within an empire. And it's interesting because as Hutchinson was trying to use history, because he was an avid historian, collected histories of the colonies, and was trying to use these histories to show that the colonies had always acknowledged the supremacy of the empire's governing bodies over provincial ones. Well, it's interesting how this sort of falls right back in his face, because following the perceived corruption and then taxation without representation of the past 8 years, Hutchinson's words evoke this response that is just so classic. It's exactly opposite of what he desired, because John Adams says, well, fine, that we haven't consented to the state of subservience that we're in, and so therefore, if, as Hutchinson said, independence or slavery, vassalage, are the only two options, then the colonies are thus independent of Parliament. And the governor comes out of this debate really just looking like a fool. And so it's very interesting. Well, that sort of takes us to 1774, and it's interesting to note that Hutchinson, because he inspired such wrath from the people, is kicked out of Massachusetts. But in his place, and I hope you caught this in your reading of Jefferson in summary view, he is replaced with a military commander, so we have General Gage for Hutchinson. Gage enforces these Coercive Acts, which we'll look at in a second. In response, there's a boycott of British goods. The Quebec Act follows. Not part of the Coercive Acts, though the colonists lumped them in as they thought about the acts. Also in 1774, James Wilson, who would become so influential in the Constitutional Convention, he writes a pamphlet, Considerations on the Authority of Parliament, and says that colonists were not bound by the acts of the British Parliament, and that they're only dependent on the king. Well, it's interesting because these different acts, and once again, this PowerPoint, I'm excited because I feel like it has lots of great information. But don't worry about getting it all now. I would encourage you to go back and try to look at some of these things, especially the context that I'm giving, because we're just kind of skimming over the tops of it like a stone skipping across the water, just to give us a little bit more meat to work with as we talk about Jefferson. But just keep in mind, because Jefferson writes about these acts, that the Boston Port Act closed Boston's port. Nothing could come in or out. Terribly stifling economically for them, forced them into immense poverty, and and hardship. The Administration of Justice Act empowered the Massachusetts governor to transfer an official or soldier accused of a capital crime elsewhere, whether it be to another colony or back to Britain. So, of course, you don't get this fair trial by jury, which we expect as part of the rule of law. Quartering Act, once again, came back from the 1760s and empowered colonial governors to quarter troops in private homes when there weren't barracks. And then, the worst of all, the Massachusetts Government Act, and this is one that the colonists would just scream about in the pamphlets. This Government Act altered the Massachusetts Charter. It altered the very government that the people had consented to in 1691. And in these changes, they said that the the governor would now appoint the upper house with the approval of the king instead of the people appointing the upper house. And then also that the governor would be able to appoint and remove judges and sheriffs. Now, sheriffs picked juries, so this is a big deal. And only one town meeting a year could be held, and it had to be for business only. And so they're really restricting the civil liberties of the colonists in very oppressive ways. Quebec Act, like I said, not part of the Coercive Acts, but the colonists thought of it with them. It said that civil governments in Quebec would be without a representative assembly, that it would tolerate Roman Catholics, that there would be trials without juries, and that it would extend Quebec's territory to be even closer to the colonies. And so, of course, there's this ominous portent. They're thinking, wait, are we going to be next? They're taking our representation away in Quebec, and they're tolerating, papism here, popery as they would call it, trials without juries. They're saying, what is coming down the road to us? Well, here we come now to our Jefferson summary view of the rights of British America, which hopefully you've read, and the First Continental Congress. Summary view now. Hopefully you've all been able to read it. You should know that, and hopefully you caught this from the beginning of it. It was written by Jefferson as instruction to Virginia's delegates to the First Continental Congress. And so this is what he is advising them to do. So let's get to our 4Ring then, now that we've had some context.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Are the intolerable acts the same as the coercive acts?
Yes.
Same thing?
That's right. Basically, in Britain, the government called them the Coercive Acts because they wanted to coerce obedience from Massachusetts. And in America, they called them intolerable. And so they're known as the Intolerable Acts, but they're exactly the same.
And were governors like Hutchinson appointed by the king?
Mm-hmm.
So,
yes, they were.
So when you say he was replaced by General Gage, that was also done by King George?
That's right.
Okay. That's it.
Okay, great questions. Well, let's look then. And so, and Wendy, I had said this at the very beginning. I'm not sure if you had logged on yet, but this pamphlet here, this summary view, is just so unique and so rich with all these very, very interesting and radical for their time assertions. And so I think it's important. It helps us really sort of see where the direction is going in the Patriot Press. So let's reason together then. From what you've read, you've done the research already, reason, what does Jefferson say about America's ties to Great Britain?
Well, from what I read, I gathered that at this point, they still were not really thinking that they wanted to abolish their ties.
Mm-hmm.
As long as they treated them fairly.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, right? Definitely. So not calling for a complete separation yet, for sure. Definitely. Excellent. I'm glad you picked that up. What else do we see there if we actually think about the individual ties? What does Jefferson say about those ties?
Well, he talks about their immigration and how, we came here, we paid our own way, we started this place, we never asked for any help from you,
Mm-hmm.
and we came here and set up our own laws. He's kind of saying that we don't have as many ties to you as you think we have.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Definitely, right? And so it's interesting because he mentions, and of course, there are many different, you could say, sort of ties of heritage and legacy or constitutional law, that sort of thing. But there are two big ones that he mentions, and he says that one of them is no longer a tie, that it's been severed, that they're illegitimate. And then he says that the other one is still perhaps there, though there's a big qualification that he gives. So do you know what I'm talking about with these two ties? What does he say?
The tie that's been severed, isn't that Parliament? And then the tie that still might be there, that's the king.
Yeah, excellent, Walter. Excellent, right? You hit it right on the head there. So think of it. We have Parliament and we have the king. And as we know, James Wilson said that no longer are the colonies bound by any acts of Parliament, that they have proven themselves to be illegitimate because they do not want, or they are not based on the consent of the colonists. And so therefore, we've given them enough chances, now that's it. And Jefferson agrees with Wilson flatly. He just comes right out and says, you know what, Parliament's illegitimate, they have no more authority, anything they do is just a usurpation of authority. And so cut them out of the picture, that tie is severed. Okay, but it is interesting. Can you point to a line perhaps or a paragraph that talks about the tie of the king? Because there's a really interesting couple of lines where Jefferson spells it out for us.
Do you want to give us a hint as to what paragraph?
Oh, sure. Sure. Page 17, the big fat paragraph.
Okay.
I'm not sure, and maybe you didn't underline it or notice it, and that's okay. But it is in that paragraph there. Do you see anything that talks about this tie to the king, this connection? It's at the bottom of that paragraph.
The sovereign who was thereby made the central link. You talking about that?
That's right, yeah. So if you read, would you read for us, Wendy, then, since you found it, from that settlements having, which is sort of like 5 lines from the bottom, just to the end of the paragraph, please?
That settlements having been thus effected in the wilds of America, the immigrants thought proper to adopt that system of laws under which they had hitherto lived in the mother country, and to continue their union with her by submitting themselves to the same common sovereign, who was thereby made the central link connecting the several parts of the empire, thus newly multiplied.
Okay,
so
excellent.
Is the sovereign, he's talking about King George there? Is that who he means?
That's right. So basically, it is just the British king, whoever it is.
Okay.
And so at this time, it's King George. And so in your own words, then, what is he saying here? Because this is a really neat concept about these settlements in the wilds of America, what they did, and then what they chose. What does he say about that? What did they think proper?
To kind of view what they've been used to in Britain.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So here we have this very Lockean idea of the state of nature. And in that migration, we have this state of nature coming back. And the colonists chose, they left, and then they chose to come back. And they chose to stay with the British system of laws, but it was their choice. And that's so important for Jefferson, saying that this was their choice to come back. And that in coming back, they have specifically chosen, okay, that the link, okay, the greatest link, now that Parliament's out of the way, right, that connects all the points of the British Empire is this allegiance to the king, which is just so interesting. And I think probably I would say foreign to us, right, that there would be such an allegiance, but yet it's there. And so the king is this last link between America and Britain, as he calls him, this central link connecting the several parts of the empire, thus newly multiplied.
A link in what sense? That they expect him to do what for them? I mean, aside from, you know, you're our last resort for getting these complaints resolved. Aside from that, what did they want the king to, or what would the king be allowed to? How would he be allowed to interfere in their affairs?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's important to understand that the colonists saw the king as a father figure. That this father figure was supposed to intervene on their behalf, that they had a trust in this king, It's interesting because in Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, he talks about how a monarchy is founded on the principle of honor, and that truly there was supposed to be this honorable relationship where subjects would honor the father figure of the king, and where the father figure of the king would then fulfill his patriarchal responsibilities and take care of his children. And so there was this concept that had been passed down from generation to generation that the king will take care of us, that we can trust in him, and that he will help. Now, this is, of course, very theoretical, and this is sort of the, pie in the sky type thinking. But nevertheless, it was powerful enough that even men as smart as Jefferson would say, oh, no, I do acknowledge that the king is the last link, the central link. And so it's just this frame of mind that I think is very hard for us to understand in the century in which we live, but yet one that as we go and read, it was just so hard for them. In fact, as we look at how this last link is actually finally severed, we'll see how hard it was to cut this last family tie, so to speak, to Great Britain because of what it had meant for so long. I have some another question here, which is interesting. It's related. So what charge, can you reason, does Jefferson put forth that goes further than Wilson? This is James Wilson, who had said that the colonies were not bound by the Acts of Parliament. What charge does he put forth? And, of course, this is related to what we've been talking about. I'm not sure how many of you were able to read all of the summary view, but what's most of it about? The big sort of middle chunk, would you say?
It kind of reminded me of the Declaration of Independence. It kind of goes through a list of usurpations. And first starting off with legislative usurpations and then with the problems they have with the king.
Excellent, excellent, Wendy, right? I love how you made that connection to the Declaration of Independence because in so many ways it follows the same format where we have this long train of abuses, right, and usurpations, okay, so to speak, where he says, okay, and then you did this, and then you did that, and then you did this, and then you did that. And it's so interesting because as he's going through, I mean, almost, year by year in some instances, he gets to the point where, let's go to page 22. If you flip to page 22, there's the fat paragraph in the middle. And sort of right in the middle of that fat paragraph is this charge by Jefferson against the king, where he summarizes what he has seen over the past decade. Did anybody pick up on that? I'm not sure if you marked that. Did anybody mark what he... What was that?
About slavery?
It's actually just above what he says about slavery, starting with, yet this will not excuse. Right in the middle there. Do you see? It's 1, 2, 3.
I see it, yeah.
Okay, so what does he say there?
Well, I can read it.
Oh, please do.
Yet this will not excuse the wanton exercise of this power which we have seen His Majesty practice on the laws of the American legislatures.
Okay, excellent. So, what is he charging there?
Well, I'm not sure what legislature he was talking about, the colonies or Parliament, but he said that legislatures had passed laws and he was in effect vetoing them.
Okay, right? And in fact, perhaps even more general, what kind of a father figure has the king been over the past decade?
One not performing
Tyrannical?
his duty.
Well, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Not doing his duty.
Excellent, right? He says the wanton exercise of power, which we've seen His Majesty practice. Okay, we think about wanton, right? It has this connotation of actually licentiousness, if you look in the Webster's 1828 dictionary, which is interesting. But it's really just not acting in a way you're supposed to act, right? It's this corrupted exercise, right, of something that's supposed to be good, right? That's why the word wanton is usually used in terms in reference to chastity, because it's something that is supposed to be sacred, but that is desecrated, right? And that's what he's charging the king with here, which is so interesting. And so as we think about this, Jefferson, if you flip to page 23, he talks about how, okay, king, I'm charging you and I'm warning you that, yeah, you're our father figure, but just barely, because you have been so bad for so long. And at the very bottom of 23, he says something that's so interesting. I really love this here. He says, while those bodies are in existence to whom the people, this is just 3 lines from the bottom of 23, while those bodies are in existence to whom the people have delegated the powers of legislation, they alone possess and may exercise those powers. But when they are dissolved by the lopping off one or more of their branches, the power reverts to the people, who may exercise it to unlimited extent, etc. And so what warning is Jefferson sending? Would you say here?
Well, that they're going to take complete control over what's going on.
Okay, if what would you say?
If he doesn't start using his power more correctly.
Excellent, right? Exactly. That's exactly what he says, right? And in fact, he goes into it even more clearly on page 25, but we'll use that in a second, so we'll come back to page 25. But yeah, that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying, listen, okay, now I am formally charging you here, okay, with being a bad dad, and because of that, if you don't shape up, we will use our power to reconstitute our political society, right? Think about Locke, right? We've talked about these different steps, the right to revolution, the people created government, they have the right to change their creation, right? The people are sovereign. That's the same thing Jefferson's saying here. Well, I have another little diagram for you. And actually just first just this quote. It's interesting because he just makes these assumptions about empire so clear, saying that Parliament now does not have jurisdiction over the colonies, that anything they do now is usurpation. The king, he does have authority, but it's limited, right? And it's so important to remember that, as he says, kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people, right? Which is so important. It's so Jeffersonian in its phrasing. Okay, the king is bound by laws. He's part of this contract, and if he does not live up to his end of the contract, well, they can reconstitute society and change things. Here's just a little diagram that I think might help. It sort of talks about these two major governmental links to Great Britain, Parliament and the king. And so, of course, by 1774, as we've talked about, James Wilson had said that the colonies were not bound by the acts of the British Parliament, right? No consent equals no legitimacy. And so that link is severed. And by 1774, as we're talking about, just in summary here, Thomas Jefferson had said that the colonies would continue their union with Britain by submitting themselves to the same common sovereign, who was thereby made the central connecting link, but he warned that the colonies would not continue to excuse the wanton exercise of his power. So keep that in mind if that visual helps you think about the links and where things are going to go. Okay, so now this is something that Wendy alluded to at the beginning here. Let's reason. What does Jefferson say about migration to America and Saxons? And this is one of the very unique contributions of this paper here of Jefferson's, this pamphlet, or this set of instructions. Very unique and really just fascinating. What does he say about this migration to America? Go all the way back to the beginning, pages 16 and 17.
Well, what I got
to me, the coolest thing. Sorry.
Go ahead,
It'd
Wendy.
be so much easier if we could see each other in a classroom.
Yes, I agree.
So the most interesting thing to me is that he says no one would ever say that the Saxons came where? The German area, I'm guessing?
That's right. The Teutonic woods of Germany.
Okay. So he's saying no one would ever say that Germany would have tried to exercise control over them once they got here. That they came here, they came to Britain and formed a government that they thought best suited them, and that the land they left didn't have control over them.
Definitely, right? So what, it was well stated, Wendy, what ideas here, is Jefferson borrowing? What is he borrowing that we've talked about before? Excuse me.
Locke.
Locke, right? And what about Locke? Just if you could, in your own words, give us a little synopsis.
The state of nature idea, and then setting up a form of government that suits you best.
Excellent, right? Excellent. And this is so important to Jefferson's argument. And it's really, I think it's just so interesting to think about. And I love, and I have to point out here that I love what Jefferson says about natural rights at the very, very beginning, because they tie right into creating a government and all of that. Because he says, and this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down from the very start of the paper. Upon those rights which God and the laws have given equally and independently to all. And I just love thinking about that, right? These natural rights, God-given, that in this migration process, the Americans were able to exercise anew and reset up society, this political society. And it's interesting, Jefferson he would be so upset if the reader didn't get that he was saying, and we chose to come back. We chose to leave, and we chose to come back, but under our terms and with our governments. And so we have this refounding event, this state of nature event in 1607 or 1620 or 1630, which is it's just so important to him. It's so neat. Well, I have some quotes about this here because it's a really interesting idea. It's this concept of paradise regained, to sort of play on words with Milton's Paradise Lost, and then he wrote Paradise Regained as well. But so many Americans, and as well as Enlightenment philosophers, saw America as this new state of nature that was so exciting because it was the application of their own ideas about government. And I have this quote here. Walter, would you read this quote for us, please?
Sure. Just as their Saxon ancestors had left their native wilds and woods in the north of Europe, the settlers of America had emigrated to create in a new land civil and ecclesiastical governments, purer, freer than those they had left behind. The transplantation had been made from an undefiled branch of the nation, strong, healthy, brimming with the juices of liberty, and it had been placed in a soil perfect for its growth. And the colonies sought and settled as an asylum for liberty. Civil and religious virtue continued to be fortified by the simplicity of life and the lack of enervating luxury.
Okay. So think of it. America was supposed to be purer, freer than the governments that it left behind. And then to continue, this was not merely a parochial view or just an American view of themselves, though the idea that America was a purer and freer England came largely from local nonconformist readings of history. It was reinforced, and this is so important, by powerful elements within Enlightenment thought. European Illuminati continued to identify America, as John Locke had done, with something approximating a benign state of nature, and to think of the colonies as special preserves of virtue and liberty. What do you think about that?
So you're saying even over in Britain, they thought of this. They thought the same thing, that America was pure and.
Definitely. There were so many philosophers that said, we've become corrupted. We're starting to rot. We're too old. We're burdened. We need to prune ourselves. And America, though, is this young branch that's growing freely.
Wow, I didn't know they thought that.
Yeah. This is cool stuff. I mean, this is stuff that makes him want to, get up out of bed in the morning, come to school. So it's really neat to think about. Well.
And did they think that because they'd probably never been to America, but were they just reading stuff about America?
Yeah. Well, they were. I mean, if you think about the 17th century, right? We have all of the Pilgrim groups and Puritan groups leaving, right, because of perceived corruption or because of very real persecution, right? And so they're leaving, right, this corrupted land for freedom, for a purer experience where they can just set out on their own and remake society in a pure image of freedom and liberty and rights. Held naturally in this state of nature. So to many philosophers, think about it. I mean, many of the common people perhaps didn't care, and perhaps those who were entangled with government couldn't see past their nose. But the philosophers who were sort of high and above everything, thinking about things in the big picture, saw America as this amazing experiment.
Cool.
This is the last thing that just is, it's so immensely profound about Jefferson's summary view. What veiled threat does he make? Were you able to reason out the veiled threat that he makes?
Well, I looked really hard for it after I looked for the questions that you were going to ask us, and is it just at the bottom of page 25 when he talks about it's neither our wish nor our interest to separate her from her?
Yeah,
we're
that's
willing
it.
on our part to sacrifice everything which reason can ask to the restoration of that tranquility for which all must wish.
That's it. You got it right there. You found the exact sentence, right? It is neither our wish nor our interest to, and he uses the S word, separate from her. Right? So we have this veiled threat that, King, if you don't shape up, right, we may even be forced to separate. And so this is extremely radical. This is ahead of its time for sure. If we were to summarize Jefferson's argument then, right, how would you reason out a summary in your own words?
Well, I think he's kind of giving him an ultimatum. He's saying, look, you need to stop, well, let's see, it's there in this paragraph here. Stop making it so that we can only get things from you, basically. And there's a couple things he mentions there. But he's basically saying you need to do this, and if you don't, then we may have to look at alternatives.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that, Heidi. What do you think, Walter?
Like Heidi said, I think he's basically just saying, a lot of the main things he's saying is take rid of the taxes and all this unjust stuff, or else we're going to have to, break our connections from Britain. And, yeah. And he's also saying that America should, or had the choice to be with Britain, so they should have the choice to be separate if Britain is not being just.
Yeah, excellent, Walter. I appreciate that reasoning. And what about you, Wendy? How would you summarize it in your own words?
Here's a list of everything the Parliament's doing wrong. Here's a list of everything King George is doing wrong. Don't let your name be a blot on the page of history. This is your final chance to fix it.
Yeah, excellent, right? So I love your words, final chance, Heidi's ultimatum, right? That's what it is. It's really powerful stuff. And like I said, truly ahead of its time. Well, here, these are just some important things. And like I said, you can go back to this PowerPoint. It'll be on Brain Honey for you. And so a summary of a summary view. So Acts of Parliament between 1764 and 1774 showed a deliberate plan to reduce the colonies to slavery, that the colonies were distinct and independent governments bound to Britain only by allegiance to a common monarch. Remember that central connecting link that we talked about? That Parliament, and this goes right along with James Wilson, Parliament had no right to exercise authority over the colonies, so that link had been severed. George is the only remaining link. But even with that link, it's now a very weak link, because George III, too, had been guilty of the wanton exercise of power, as we read. And so Jefferson charges him, as you said, with his long list of oppressive acts. He says the kings are the servants of the people, not the other way around. And so that if he doesn't shape up, right, the colonies might be driven to separation. And then this very interesting notion of state of nature through migration that we talked about. Americans had left England and returned to a state of nature. They chose to come back in 1607, and they could choose to leave again. All right, so important that we remember these things. Well, I want to relate this to Mosiah 29, 12 through 19. Could I have somebody read that for us?
Sure, I'll do it. Okay.
Thanks, Heidi.
Now it is better that a man should be judged of God than of man, for the judgments of God are always just, but the judgments of man are not always just. Therefore, if it were possible that you could have just men to be your kings, who would establish the laws of God and judge this people according to his commandments, Yea, if you could have men for your kings, who would do even as my father Benjamin did for this people, I say unto you, if this could always be the case, then it would be expedient that you should always have kings to rule over you. Now I say unto you that because all men are not just, it is not expedient that you should have a king, or kings to rule over you. For behold, how much iniquity doth one wicked king cause to be committed? Yea, and what great destruction! Yea, remember King Noah, his wickedness and his abominations, and also the wickedness and abominations of his people. Behold, what great destruction did come upon them. And also because of their iniquities they were brought into bondage. And were it not for the interposition of their all-wise Creator, and this because of their sincere repentance, they must unavoidably remain in bondage until now.
Thanks a lot, Heidi. So how do these verses relate to Jefferson's summary view?
Well, I think about the scripture all the time. If you have a good king, then you can expect him, it's like this father figure idea, you can expect him to have your best interest. But when you don't, then it causes the people also to become, well, this is so interesting, thinking of just our nation today, and I don't mean just with this last president, but several of the last presidents.
Yeah.
When the leaders, okay, the king, this is talking about kings specifically, but when the king is wicked, it causes the people also to be wicked and then put into bondage.
Excellent. Excellent. Right? And in fact, I mean, think of Jefferson. He uses the word slavery, right? How much more of a relation could you get there? Thanks so much for that, Heidi. I want to get to this really amazing quote here because there's always this question, and we always have it because we're talking about lots of wicked kings, right, in this class. But here's the question that I want you to relate, okay, to what we've been talking about. What should we do if we have a wicked king or leader ruling over us? I want to hear what you have to say, and then I have this really powerful quote by Elder Oaks that I want to share.
Well, as I've talked about this subject with many friends, to me it seems to come down to the preaching of the word, that you have to teach truth. And that's our strongest defense.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. Right, preaching the word, educating the people, trying to change, right, through ideas. Thanks so much for that. Walter, what do you think?
Yeah, just like it's already been said, just changing through ideas. And then I guess if that doesn't work, you can do like the colonies did. You could maybe do something, I don't know, maybe these days it probably might not even work, but I mean...
Something like revolution?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that, Walter. Well, let's see here. Let's finish up with Elder Oaks. This is from the Ensign. This is before he was Elder Oaks. It was published in the Ensign, though. This is when he was the president of BYU, 1976, pages 61, 62 in the June Ensign of 1976. Here, and this is just so interesting. As long as the government is a representative one, so that aggrieved persons can work to enlarge their freedoms and relieve their oppressions by legal and peaceful means, a Latter-day Saint citizen's duty is that of being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, and obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. There are exceptions to this duty discussed below, but they are extremely limited. All governments formed and administered by imperfect men will be oppressive and limit our freedoms in some measure, since they will inevitably mirror the imperfections of those who rule and those who are ruled. For this reason, we promote the cause of freedom and good government when we fulfill our religious duty to work for good laws, seek diligently for honest and wise rulers, and preach repentance to all citizens. Even when victimized by what they must surely have seen as very severe government oppressions and abridgments of freedom, the Mormon people and their leaders have remained loyal to their government and its laws. The compliant position outlined in the 12th Article of Faith, quoted above, was written during the Nauvoo period after almost a decade of persecutions that government officials either conducted, condoned, or refused to redress. Just after the Saints were forcibly driven out of Jackson County, Missouri, with great hardship and loss of property, the Lord revealed his will that they should continue to importune for redress and redemption by the hands of those who are placed as rulers and are in authority over you. The Declaration of Belief, later adopted by the Church, affirmed that the laws of all men owe respect and deference, as without them peace and harmony would be supplanted by anarchy and terror. These principles and precedents and others too numerous to cite in this limited space are persuasive evidence that even an oppressive government that limits freedom is preferable to a state of lawlessness and anarchy in which the only ruling principle is force and every individual citizen has 1,000 oppressors. Abraham Lincoln was espousing this preference when he said, "There is no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law." There are exceptions, and this, I think, is just so interesting for us. There are exceptions, he says. The command of loyalty to laws and rulers does not compel a citizen to participate in or submit to a government edict that runs counter to the common consensus of humanity, such as genocide or other cold-blooded murder, nor should it require a person to violate the fundamental tenets of religious faith. For example, if the current laws permitting abortion, which are highly objectionable, were expanded to requiring abortion in certain instances, an unwilling mother and father who regarded this practice as one of the most revolting and sinful practices in this day, from the first presidency, would be justified in refusing to observe the law. Another exception is specified in our Declaration of Belief, which proclaims that human law has no right to interfere in prescribing rules of worship to bind the consciences of men, nor dictate forms for public or private devotion. An additional exception is hinted in the Doctrine and Covenants sections that proclaim the duty of government to protect our rights of conscience, property, life, and religious belief and practice, and which may condition our duty of loyalty to a government that fails to fulfill those obligations. Anyway, and so he talks about exceptions, but basically says we have to have ordered liberty, but keep those exceptions in mind. I think they're very important, especially as we think about what's going on in this day and age.
Well, especially considering what he just said last week, that talk that he gave about religious liberties being taken over.
Excellent, Wendy.
Well, and
excellent, right? That is an amazing connection, and that was actually the very first thing that came to my mind when I was reading this last night. I've actually always loved this quote, but it has so much more meaning if you think about what Elder Oaks is speaking about these days, even, on the 13th of October when he talked about religious freedom. Well, the question I want to leave you with then is, you are a member of the First Continental Congress. You have read Summary Review and must cast a vote for or against its sentiments. What is your vote and why? Think about that question because we're out of time. But you should know that Jefferson's views were slightly ahead of their time and far too radical to receive the approval of either the Virginia Convention or the First Continental Congress, but they were significant in indicating the direction of patriot protest. So think about that this week. And like I said, please feel free to go back to the PowerPoint and review all the slides. There's lots of great stuff. And then for Monday, we'll discuss Jefferson, and then it was also toned down a little by Dickinson, but it's mostly Jefferson, the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, 1775. Thanks so much for a great class today, and I hope you have a great day.
Okay, thank you.
See you later.